Hey there, just butting in at the front of this episode to let you know that for the next couple of episodes we'll be taking up a slightly slower than usual release schedule of one episode every 3 weeks to help us smooth over some scheduling issues. Don't worry, we're not going away, and we're still committed to producing an excellent show, but scheduling things happen, and we would prefer to slow down for a little while rather than take an extended break. As always, thanks for your support, and I hope you enjoy the show. And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this week we have no guests, unfortunately. It's the OG unit crew back in action. But we're going to be talking over the next episode or two about a book called The Cybernetic Brain by Andrew Pickering, which I think came out in 2010. And it's really cool. It's like a big sort of history of cybernetics, but like particularly about this loosely affiliated group of cyberneticians that were of a slightly different strain than is usually sort of acknowledged. I found this to be absolutely fascinating material because going into this, I thought I knew cybernetics, and I really didn't, you know?
Right, yeah. We've seen a little bit through All Watched Over what American cybernetics looked like, and through Read Plenty, we've seen a little bit of what Soviet cybernetics looked like, but this book is mainly about British cybernetics.
Yeah, it's so like the people that are kind of named out in the book are Gray Walter, Ross Ashby. You've Stafford Beer, Gregory Bateson, R.D. Lang, and Gordon Pask are the sort of main characters. But because this book is an absolute fucking monster, it is huge. It's just colossal. So we're going to be tackling only 4 chapters. In this episode now, we're going to do the first 2 chapters, titled The Adaptive Brain and Ontological Theater. And then in the next episode, we're going to talk about the chapter on Stafford Beer, which is quite a chapter, and
it is huge and extensive. I mean, I think many people probably have read Cybernetic Revolutionaries, as you know, because of their interest in socialism and cybernetics. Which is, you know, and that is a much briefer read, and it is a you know, much more narrow exploration of Beer's career. But yeah, in this book, we get a lot of different facets and aspects of Beer's work. I think it's probably like one of the best, you know, general books to cover Beer's career, which was a big reason why I suggested that we read the book, because you know, I know there's a lot of people out there, listeners, who are interested in Project Cybersyn and that kind of thing, but I did want to give that sort of broader context of Beer's career, and then maybe we'll go back to Cybernetic Revolutionaries later on in the series.
That sounds like a good plan. It does, because yeah, this is a really sweeping, broad overview of everything, basically everything Stafford Beer had ever done, and then we'll close out that episode with the final chapter, which is Sketches of Another Future, in which Pickering just sort of like ties up a bunch of threads and sort of restates some of the themes of the book. But yeah, no, this is fantastic stuff. So yeah, Kyle, why don't you lead us into to chapter 1?
All right. Well, you know, the first chapter is called The Adaptive Brain, and one of the main reasons why it is titled that is because Pickering wanted to emphasize that for this particular group of cyberneticians, the human brain is a point of great importance, right? That is the point where they begin thinking from. And that is not necessarily the case of all cybernetics. And certainly it is a point that struck Pickering because, in the conclusion to the book, he talks about how when he started this project, he realized that he would actually have to learn something about brain science and became extremely dismayed by this prospect.
Yeah, I get the impression that this whole project took him on a hell of a trip, all over different sort of topics and stuff. And that is a kind of characteristic of cybernetics, right? That it ties together so many different fields, from complexity theory to information technology, psychiatry, neurology, all sorts of different fields are sort of tied up together in this kind of this sort of meta field, which is fascinating, right? Because that's not the case of many other disciplines, right? This seems kind of strange in the way it all came about.
Yeah, and to the point that it's hard to say what cybernetics even is as a discipline, right? So it is very, very interesting in that way. But yes, certainly I think that's true. Pickering's background was in physics, and physics figures in here and there in cybernetics, certainly. But for this group, the brain and brain science and psychiatry is sort of the point of departure.
And specifically, the kind of the core point of departure is that there's the way Pickering puts it is that there's kind of two ways of seeing the brain, right? You can see it in the kind of traditional sense of an organ of knowledge and representation, but these guys see it quite differently. That it is that, but it is also an agent and an acting machine and a sort of thing that does performances and that uses representational knowledge to adapt to its environment. And it's this much more sort of much more active embodied sort of interpretation of the brain and the sort of its kind of energies as being kind of directed towards adaptation into its environment.
Right. Yes. Yes, absolutely. It is very much the embodied brain and not the brain understood as a sort of discrete organ. So that's very much the concern of this first chapter, is just to sort of lay that out a little bit, and to give an overview of where this particular group of cyberneticians fits within the sort of the broader scheme and history of cybernetics. So, as you would expect, Pickering does start off the chapter with talking about Norbert Wiener, the very famous cybernetician who wrote Cybernetics, or Controlling Communication in the Animal and the Machine.
That was a great title.
Yeah, I just love it. It is a really good title, and this book was actually quite a success with a popular audience. It was kind of, I think you could kind of compare it in terms of recent books maybe to Piketty's book on capitalism, right? That it is one of those books that becomes a hot topic, sells a lot of copies, and then most of the people who buy it don't understand what it's about. Right? Because the general sort of impression I get from reading about cybernetics or controlling communication in the animal and the machine is that a lot of people read it and were sort of just overawed by the mathiness of it. And then they were like, wow, cybernetics sure is some smart stuff. Okay.
It's a good coffee table book, right, to make you look smart.
Yeah, totally. For those people who did actually understand what Wiener was going on about, it was quite a large influence, though, beyond that broader audience. And then there's, some discussion about the Macy conferences, which were the big American cybernetics gathering. Many very famous scientists of various disciplines gathering for those. But this is a story that sort of exists tangential to that, and doesn't really have a very clear sort of like institutional basis in any way.
Yeah, that's very much the point of like that kind of like Pickering keeps reinforcing, is that like these guys didn't have much of a social sort of basis for their work at all. Like it was very nomadic and sort of wandering around and kind of like taking up projects here and there, and very, very sort of experimental and emergent. But I also kind of want to, like, before we leave Wiener entirely, because like that's basically the only time he'll come up in the book. He
does show up once when Beer goes to go see him, and he gives him a big hug or something, right? It's like,
oh, I suppose, yeah.
They
were chums, yeah. But the origins of the word cybernetics are really interesting, and it's interesting in itself, but it's also like it's something that will come up a bit later. But it comes from the Greek word kybernetes or kubernetes, which sort of is basically like steersman or governor. It is actually the root from which we get the word governor as well, like Kubernetes, governor, and that sort of thing. And it was sort of billed by Wiener as this like science of steersmanship, which is sort of a really interesting way of setting it up, right? Like it's often billed as a science of control, but I think the science of steersmanship is much closer to the actual kind of core truth of what this field is really about.
Yeah, it is. So, there is that view of cybernetics that sort of departs from the fact that the discipline got kicked off in the U.S. military, and that sort of like fire control devices, tracking mechanisms for weapons were many of the inspirations for Wiener in writing his work, and that sort of view tends to see cybernetic technology as this science of control, of tracking purposively the target so that you can destroy it, so that you can alter the situation to your advantage, right?
It's like a very Terminator sort of thing.
Yeah, totally, right? Like, in sort of later popular imagination, I think that like, terms like robot, android, cyborg, Terminator all sort of get rolled together into this kind of scary techno mess, right? But the one way that maybe you can think about this science of steersmanship is that, one of the things that cybernetic mechanisms characteristically do is that they seek homeostasis, right? They seek to adapt to their environment, and that adaptation to the environment you can see as being similar to the behavior or the activity of steersmanship, right? Dealing with the currents, right? Navigating your boat in a changing situation with the wind and the current. But cybernetics as a science is kind of a science of designing that adaptive behavior, right? Yeah, so that I think that that idea of like the science of steersmanship, it's kind of a hard concept to grasp. It's like, well, what the hell does that mean? Does that just mean like being good at steering? Like, is that what this is about? No, it's sort of like one level removed from that, right? That it is designing the behavior of steersmanship,
right? And like I just said as well, like I thought I got this, but I really didn't until I actually finished this book, right? Like there was something really profound in kind of reading through this and like really finally actually understanding what that whole steersmanship metaphor was about.
Yeah, and it's easy to get wrong, right? Because like, you think about steersmanship, like especially if you're someone like myself who has only a rather limited experience with steersmanship, like who actually like actually steering a boat is something I haven't done a terrible amount in my life.
Oh, I'm far too delicate for that kind of thing. It's not my fucking deal at all.
Yeah, and so like it's kind of unintuitive if you don't actually have any experience of doing the thing, and all you have is the picture in your head of some person with their hand on a rudder, right, or on a wheel. Yeah. So anyway, I think that is the sort of crucial point of what is meant by steersmanship there.
Right, and the way these cyberneticians do this sort of like science of steersmanship, and the way they sort of explore building these systems that can steer themselves is through or what was originally through this like building these like novel sort of mechanisms and machines that would exhibit these kinds of characteristics of being like devices which were reactive and adaptive. That's where we get the homeostat, which is I think the precursor to the thermostat, or like I think a thermostat is a kind of homeostat.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Right. And there's also these cool like robot tortoises which come up and like
yes. These were constructed by Ashby. Or no, sorry, Walter, Gray Walter built these. Robot tortoises, or as he called them, machina speculatrix. Yes. So these are new species, a new inorganic species, as he sort of pretentiously said on the BBC and elsewhere. But these were rather simple machines that displayed more complex behaviors when they were put into action. And this is not because they were given some kind of rather complex instruction set. It was just because they had a receptivity to the world and a capacity for adaptation that, when put out in the world and in an active way, would sort of start to represent the world back to itself, right? That they would do things in interaction with their environment, and therefore become more complex than just the little simple machines with like a receptor and a motor and some wheels and stuff that they are, right?
And it's like the sort of magic watchword there is feedback, right? That it's in the simplest sort of sense of like, your thermostat, it has a reading from the environment of like the actual temperature in the room. It has an internal variable of like a target temperature, and it's kind of got this like continuous process of like feeding back the information and trying new sort of adjustments to try and reach that target. This is all like crucially, this is in contrast with like almost all objects we actually interact with, like cars, televisions, toasters, bridges, almost anything you can name doesn't have these characteristics, right? Like the cars don't adapt to fucking anything, like even the smartest machines in your presence, like your phone or your computer, it doesn't adapt to shit, right? Like it's famously doesn't connect to the Wi-Fi, like it's makes a point of not interacting with its environment.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you can say that a lot of these machines have over time been given adaptive characteristics, right? Like, like we've put computers in our cars so that they will we have things like sensors in our cars that deal with the changes in the surface of the road and stuff like that, right? Like these kinds of adaptive systems have been introduced into these technologies, but fundamentally the technologies are designed to be indifferent to their environments. Like that is the point of departure for these technologies.
Yeah. No, it's great stuff. And like the sort of next major sort of thing that like the author talks about is that like, so having established this sort of thing about like the brain as an active agent, that's one of the major things that'll be sort of strewn throughout the entire book. But the other thing that will come up again and again is this like notion of like symmetric versus asymmetric sort of relations between objects, and this kind of comes out of a reaction to early psychiatry. So that like the psychiatrists of like the 50s and 60s kind of like this like anti-psychiatry movement were reacting to this like really brutal sort of electroshock therapy that was being used to treat patients in the 30s up through the 50s. And the characteristic of that early technique is that it's asymmetrical, right? Like it is a commander in the form of the doctor administering a unidirectional force to the patient who is meant to, and the patient is meant to change but not the doctor, right? Like that's the asymmetry of it. Whereas these later thinkers emphasize the need for like symmetrical kind of relations where like in psychiatry specifically, where both the patient and the doctor change, right? Like, and they adapt, or they at the very least, behave as if they are peers rather than, commander and subject. But this idea is then generalized as well, right? Like that, it's like symmetrical relations between complex systems allow the systems to adapt to each other and to kind of move in this kind of mutually adjusting kind of way, which is that other big theme of cybernetics.
Yeah, absolutely. Beer sort of called it like viability, right? Is this a capacity for adaptation, and made that sort of a centerpiece of his thinking.
And so like I found it really interesting here that like this is in only a couple of pages, like we kind of get from like adaptive machines to like adaptive selves and subjects, like adaptive psychiatry. And this kind of like eventually feeds into the notion that like cybernetics was, seen as a kind of a general theory, like a theory of everything almost, that like could be applied to practically any field.
And it has that sort of Pickering describes it as like a protean character of sort of constantly becoming new things. But I think also it's interesting to note on the point that you raised there about that sort of like strange permeability between the organic and the mechanical, or the electronic in cybernetics, which down the line we see in the notion of the cyborg and the notion of cybernetic modification of the body and in cyberpunk, right? Like this is this kind of fluidity of identity and of the body as related to the techno structures of the world is something that's gone on to like inspire a whole lot of thought, a whole lot of fiction, well beyond the sort of rather clinical understanding that it had at the start, right? Where it was just like, well, thinking about the brain as a organ of knowledge with like faculties that determine things and all that kind of stuff isn't so interesting. So I'm just going to try to take like some characteristic of the brain and model it in a machine, right? And see what happens. That's kind of where they started, and then we go all the way down the line and we get these rather sort of like radical theories of selfhood, like we get like Haraway and stuff like that, which is also coming out of cybernetics. Yeah,
and it's like, I think so. It's also like it should be pretty clear as well that like Pickering is kind of getting at the notion that like this isn't accidental. This isn't sort of accidental, right? That it is because it is an immensely fruitful avenue of investigation, and that's why we should be taking it seriously in the 21st century, right? That like which I buy, like this. I am convinced, definitely.
Right.
Yeah. So the other sort of like there's also kind of like, as well as like talking about the like cybernetics itself and all of its sort of like theoretical foundations, Pickering is also talking about like the people involved, right? Like the chapters are like about individual personalities, but also like he's talking about the context they were sort of working in, and particularly this sort of like essentially kind of a constant absence of like a consistent social basis for their work, right? Like they, it's what he sort of refers to it as marginality. and even a sort of an amateurism in the sense of the kind of like original meaning of the word, of like these sort of like enthusiasts who were doing this work without any stable institutional support.
Yeah. He writes, unlike more familiar sciences such as physics, which of course is where Pickering came from, which remain fixed to specific academic departments and scholarly modes of transmission. Cybernetics is better seen as a form of life, a way of going on in the world, even an attitude that can be and was instituted both within and beyond academic departments, mental institutions, businesses, political organizations, churches, concert halls, theaters, and art museums. Like there is no institutional boundary that marks off what is cybernetics from the rest of the world, right? Like it is just this thing that, yes, it had some presence in the academy, but it was a thing that would come and go from the academy. It did not perpetuate itself as an institution because it was basically anti-disciplinary, right? It was a thing that happened by chance encounters, not by indoctrination of students by teachers.
Yeah, there's very little continuity here between like successive generations of like master and apprentice, right? Like you would see in other fields.
Yeah, there are generations, but the mode of transmission between the generations is typically, the younger person happens to read something that the older person wrote or hears about their work. And then contacts them or just goes and uses their ideas to start with by themselves, right? Like it's just like, oh, like, hey, this is neat. As opposed to, signing up for a major in cybernetics and then having 4 years of indoctrination.
So like Stafford Beer starts doing Ashby fanfic, and just more or less. But I find this kind of fascinating that so cybernetics has this sort of characteristic of being like spreading everywhere, right, and being sort of applicable to so many different domains and like seeping into all sorts of different fields. But it also seems to be basically invisible, right? Because when I sort of remarked to a colleague about the sort of like reading this particular book, and his response was, well, it's essentially along the lines of, I didn't think that was a thing anymore, cybernetics.
Yeah.
Or I didn't...
because it didn't have any institutional identity, so it hasn't died, but to the extent that it has continued to go on, it doesn't even necessarily maintain its own name of cybernetics, right?
Well, it's now a complexity theory, right? And all sorts of different sort of things. Like I think there's a lot of work being done that you could quite honestly label as cybernetics, but that just doesn't call itself that.
Right, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And that's kind of what Pickering's trying to get at here, is that like it would be really nice to bring this back into the popular imagination and to tie these threads back together again, so that it just were a thing, right? That you could put a name on and like hang your hat on it, and that it could help us out with quite a few of the sort of problems we've been seeing in the last couple of decades, But that's more for the last chapter. But yeah.
I guess we've been doing our part, labeling this podcast.
Definitely, yeah. It's so. I found this like to be really interesting in that like, because that thing of like it's like when you read a book and it's sort of like it is new information, but it also just sort of like confirms a lot of things you've been thinking all along, but in much more clear language than you've been thinking them. That's my experience of reading this. And yeah, it's this like feels good. This feels like hand in glove, like a sort of really, really good fit for the kind of the problems of this next sort of century or so.
Yeah. So aside from what we've already discussed, one thing that sort of goes with that anti-disciplinary character is that usually the people who worked in this area had irregular employment, right? Like they would go from one job to another, even in periods when that was quite unusual, right? Like, you know, now, like we have the gig economy and so on, but at the time that a lot of these guys were working, it would be quite unusual to be changing jobs as frequently as they did if you were a white-collar professional sort of person, right?
Yeah, like especially like, so you look at Stafford Beer's like career sheet or whatever, and it's just like, it's basically reads as an adventurer, right? Like he like, especially for Britain in the 1960s or whatever, that's pretty weird, right? Like it's it wasn't a culture that really sort of encouraged that kind of adventurism in sort of like the careers.
Yeah, and he, like, you know, became a cybernetic consultant to various companies during sort of like the business period of his life. But like, he pretty much invented the notion of cybernetic consultancy in order to have that job, right? Like he did that thing of like inventing your own job definition before that was very common at all, right?
So is he like, he's the original tech bootstraps entrepreneur, right? Like just sort of like creating his own opportunities.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I mean, yes and no. Like, he did certainly come from like a institutional basis of like having done that within a giant corporation before he moved on to consulting. But yes, like, yeah, he like, there is a lot of stuff in this book that you can see that, like, you know, was done in the 50s or 60s, which you can see like, oh, that's like very common in the tech sector now, right? Like, tons of stuff that has gone on to be realized in more contemporary technologies and practices. And so, you know, there certainly is a way in which we have to think about it critically, to the extent that we are like concerned with the way that tech actually works today, right? Like, you know, like, I mean, this is the thing I think I want to talk about in the conclusions, but yeah, I have some sort of ambiguous feelings about that. So yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting point about the way that these careers progressed. And the other thing is that, to the extent that they were able to reproduce the discipline, or what, AntiDiscipline, it was usually through gatherings, right? It wasn't through like ongoing institutions. It was like, hey, let's have a meeting, let's go chat, you know, like trying to get people together from different countries. And if you can't do that, then at least get people together from within the same country, and, you know, get together at this ratio club and hang out and smoke and chat.
This just seems like the coolest lifestyle. Like, I'm looking at the photos of this stuff, I'm like, oh my god, I was born in the wrong era. It's like,
well, yeah, but chances are you would have been the schlub who was forced to work in accounting, in some giant corporation for your entire life, and you'd have no chance to change careers or anything, right? Yeah. Like, it's almost, you certainly know, these men were very much the exception, not the rule, right? Like, yeah, they were weirdos who were
very strange boys.
Yeah, so the alternate title to this book, The Cybernetic Brain, or Very Strange Boys.
Oh fuck. But there is a sort of crossover though with like assorted very strange boys, though, in that like just the 60s counterculture, right? Like, was like a lot of these guys were involved in it in various sorts of ways, and like Ashby was hanging around the sort of London art scene. Beer was like at this sort of the crossroads of like Eastern spirituality in the 60s. The two guys the guys we're not going to be talking about in these episodes, but like Lang and Bateson were sort of big into the kind of London drug scene as well, and yeah, just like really strange stuff kicking off all over the place seems to be the sort of message there, and like the pivot point seems to be the like common interest in a sort of exploration of the non-modern self, right? Like, and strange performances and expressions and like altered states. altered states of both the mind and matter and all this sort of stuff. It's real proper 60s stuff, you know?
Oh, yeah, definitely. We saw in All Watched Over the extent to which sort of cybernetic thinking was a part of hippie culture. And this kind of just, like, not as much with the chapter we're going to be covering, but with some of the other chapters, you can definitely see the extent to which that crossover was happening.
Yeah, and it's like there's a substantial kind of crossover with like Eastern spirituality as well.
Yes, which we will get to talk about
with Beer, because he seems to be the main one that's the biggest into that stuff. But it's just all over the place, right? Like there's these little touch points for each one of these stories, and these common themes that are constantly repeated throughout the book. There was one sort of maybe sort of interesting bit towards the end of chapter 1 about this sort of like gesturing towards like the political dimension of Pickering's interest in cybernetics, and he starts to touch on some of the critiques of cybernetics as like the one critique he sort of like gets at is that like we've already covered it really, but like this sort of critique of like it originating from kind of militarism, and like I think we've established that actually no, it hasn't really, and like Pickering points out that like of the sort of international collective of cyberneticians, like only one of them was really from a military background, or like two, if you count Stafford Beer's like brief stint in the British military. But I suppose as well, like sort of like a lot of people of that age in that time would have had some sort of touch point with the military anyway. But like it's only really Wiener that like had a career in the sort of military industrial complex.
Yeah, and I mean, they're like as Pickering is at pains to stress or to point out, like this is a history of cybernetics. It is not the definitive history of cybernetics, because there is another history of cybernetics that we could tell, which very much is like deeply integrated into the military industrial complex, right? And that's something probably worth exploring later in the show, right? Like, and that kind of like talks or speaks more to the sort of stuff that Adam Curtis has talked about. But there is also this history of cybernetics, which is substantial and like is also something that happened almost entirely outside of military institutions.
Yeah, definitely. But I find it sort of interesting and kind of reassuring that Pickering does take the time to, at various points throughout the book, to kind of like address these critiques that like have been leveled against these practitioners.
Yeah, I mean, because especially like in the case of like Beer, there were sort of like constant criticisms of that nature leveled against him, right? Yeah.
But I think we'll get to that in Beer's chapter as well. So chapter 2 does bring us on to like it again. Like I love when things are titled well. But the title is Ontological Theater. And the core idea here is that like the ontology of cybernetics is pretty weird, right? Like by modern standards, and in many ways it is in fact like explicitly counter-modern.
So should we first describe what ontology is for our listeners before we move on to ontological theater? We need to set the stage before we get the theater going.
Go for it.
So in philosophy, there's sort of like two big games that people often talk about. One of which is epistemology, and the other of which is ontology. And epistemology is a system of theories and discussions about how we know things, right? How can we have knowledge? How can we have access to truth, right? It's a way of thinking that is, very, very skeptical about what it is that we do know in the world, right? That's sort of like a classic characteristic of philosophy, is to be skeptical about our experiences of the world, and tries to build up sort of systems and justifications and critiques of how we know things. So this is really sort of like famously found in like, Descartes' like radical doubt about the world, right? Or in Kant's thing in itself way of thinking about the world. Another way of thinking about things is ontology, and ontology is like a theory of what is in the world. So maybe some of our listeners will be more familiar with the terms of ontology because it is a thing that occasionally comes up in computer science. What sort of objects are in your programming language? That is the ontology of your programming language. Or do you have objects at all, right? Mm-hmm. Like,
get the Haskell boys in.
Yeah, right. Yeah, those are different ontologies, right? Uh-huh. But in a broader sense, outside of programming or outside of computer science, ontology is a way of talking about what sorts of things are in the world and how are we with them, and what sorts of things are we. Also, so it's more of a what is here instead of like how do we know what is here, right? And therefore there is this emphasis on things instead of just things in the very abstract sense. Like, oh yeah, there's stuff out there, but like that's not really what we're interested in. We're interested in how we know what is there in epistemology. In ontology, it's like, okay, but what is there?
Right, yeah. It's so like ontology is what is there, and epistemology is how do we know it. But it's also maybe kind of important to point out that like Pickering and like we throughout the reading of this will use kind of like knowledge and representation sort of interchangeably. That like if you have knowledge of something, you have a representation of it. Kind of like
usually in language.
Yeah, right. Like it's a linguistic construct that like refers or like kind of represents the actual thing. And we'll kind of get to it like shortly, but like the kind of general idea here is that like that's in like the sort of modern times, like we have this kind of like overemphasis of knowledge and a sort of underemphasis of like things and how they actually behave.
Yes, and that is like a key point for why Pickering originally found cybernetics to be interesting, is because it went beyond just sort of talking about ontology in a very abstract way to actually designing objects and projects and experiences that dealt with specific ontological relations or, specific things in the world.
And we can call back to what we just mentioned, in the first chapter about like the two ways of thinking about the brain, right? Like you have the way of thinking of the brain as a engine of representation, of purely of knowledge, or you can think of it as a engine of knowledge plus an engine of activity and relating to things, like a thing that acts upon other things and relates to them.
It's adaptive.
Adaptive, right? Yeah, it's because in a world of knowledge, in a world of pure representation, there can't be adaptation. Like what's adapting to what if there are no objects, right? Like
that is where Kant gets to in understanding the transcendental subject, right? Like when you like there is this idea of God as pure knowing, sort of, and if you get to that point, then God actually sort of paradoxically becomes incredibly stupid, right? Because God knows everything, but there is nothing to know except himself. So it becomes this kind of like completely empty system of representation. You can see that in this kind of practice that we have here, we go very much the opposite direction, right? We don't go to this ultimate idea of the world as reduced down to a contentless knowing. We instead go towards a vision of the world where there is so much stuff, right? And it is so various that we could never, and no one could ever comprehend it in a representational scheme.
so the content of the world is so rich that it escapes knowledge. That is, it's unknowable, and that's kind of what Pickering will try to get to here, is that like a non-modern ontology of unknowability. But I think to get there, we probably need to back up a little bit to, well, if it's a non-modern ontology, then what is the modern ontology? And he begins from a Bruno Latour's take on this modernity, where it's sort of all about dualism, right? Like you have this kind of like in modernity, you have this like world of people contrasted with a world of things. You have like the split between sort of like I think the implicit like Cartesian split between mind and matter and all these sorts of things. And we tend to think this way of like splitting things into like inside and outside. We kind of do this dualism. But cybernetics is like, in contrast, like very much about systems, complex systems that kind of like break down that division, right? Like, as we saw before, it's like these like adaptive brains and like adaptive machines. They sort of like make the idea of there being a split between thought and matter kind of laughable, right? Like that. If sufficiently complex systems behave like living things, then there can't really be a duality. Really, it must be a continuous substance, right? Like, so it's non-dualist broadly, and the term in philosophy for that is kind of like monism, but it's not a term Pickering actually uses.
It isn't a term he uses. We will get a little bit into that discussion with beer, but. You could see this as a kind of monist ontology.
Yeah. But there's another difference as well, in that like it's a difference in like cybernetics' approach to temporality and causality. So like the modern sciences are kind of mostly concerned with this like the direct and identifiable causality where A causes B. And it's like this kind of like push and pull sort of model of causation, where the kind of like the effect is either pushed from A to B or it's pulled from A to B, and like depending on which perspective you see it from. But the cybernetic ontology is kind of different in that it sees causation as this sort of like forward search, right? That like when you're trying to determine the behavior of this like device when it's placed down in a context, there is no unambiguous causality. The cause is simply whatever happens to happen when it's placed into the environment, right? Like it's the causation or the sort of notion of temporality is emergent from the interaction between the object and its environment, which is made up of other objects in this sort of like recursive spiral of detail.
Yes, and that gets to the sort of black box idea, right?
Yeah. And that's the sort of next major thing, is that like these the sort of the black box ontology comes into it, where so like it's from like electrical engineering or whatever, the notion of a black box is like you're literally given a box that's just painted black and just has terminals for input and output, and the engineer can hook up whatever signals they want to the input and the output, and like figure out how the box behaves, but has no knowledge of its internal workings.
Right, and this is a really interesting idea, because the sort of crucial point here is that for a theory that is more based on sort of knowing and representing, the immediate impulse is to pick apart the black box and see what's inside and enumerate its components and their relations to one another, right? But in the case of a lot of these guys that we'll see in the book, that impulse is sort of deeply resisted. And they're like, no, let's not open up the black box. Let's see how the black box behaves in the world. And that is better than knowing the internals. It's not that it is just a different way. It is actually a better approach for them than the picking apart and dissecting way of doing things,
because the behavior is the point, right? Like the thing you want is the performance, like and like I think Ashby sort of emphasizes that like in our practical lives, black boxes are everywhere. Like I have no idea how the doorknob works, I've never seen the inside of one, but I still interact with it every day. And I do a performance with it, and I influence it, and then it influences the door, and then the door influences me, and this sort of stuff. And like, we actually live in that kind of mode of like existing in a black box universe, or a universe filled with black boxes. And it doesn't bother us one fucking jot, right? Like, we move through this world like effortlessly without ever knowing the interior sort of makeup of any of these objects. So it seems self-evident that, like, yeah, performance really has to have primacy over knowledge, really, you know.
And yet, like, the modern point of view is completely the opposite.
Right, exactly. Right? Like the modern sciences are like exactly upside down from that kind of perspective, right? That like, but it's also a common critique, right? That like, I think I remember hearing this phrase ages and ages ago, probably in my childhood, but then like, you know, knowing the behavior of a water molecule tells you nothing about the behavior of oceans, right? Like that is a consistent sort of meme in the culture that's like is of a kind with these sorts of critiques as well. And it's in that kind of, when you see it from that angle, it's kind of weird that like the modern sciences still have this kind of vice grip on representation over performance, right? Like it's almost like a sort of a cadaver grip. Like it just won't let go of this damn idea, regardless, you know.
Yeah, well, and that was a that was the crucial point of inspiration for Pickering himself, right? Which is that he ran into this dilemma as a scientific researcher, and then started to do research on, well, how is science actually performed, right? Instead of what is this, like, you know, what do we write down as science? How do we transmit that? And then you know, that sort of like classical philosophy of science concern about, you know, like, well, how do we determine what is truth in science and that kind of stuff? Like, no, he was more interested in, like, yes, all of that, but also how do we actually behave in a lab, right? What are our actual interactions with things that allow us to do science? So he was making that reversal, and then that is exactly what led him to write this book. Is that he saw that dilemma, and then he found some examples that were interesting to study and to discuss in the field of cybernetics.
Yeah, and it's. I mean, I'm glad he did, because it's he has a really good style of just writing with really extreme clarity about this particular issue. You can really tell he's big into it, you know.
And he also he doesn't hesitate to insert sort of editorializing and his own personal voice into the text, which is something that's very difficult to do in an academic text, because we're taught to do otherwise, right? We're taught to remove ourselves from the picture completely.
Well, it's performance, you know?
Yeah.
he's performing.
So I mean, he's representing himself as the person who is entangled in the work, and you know, I can definitely appreciate that a lot, because it's something that I've tried to do in my academic writing and generally failed at, because it is really challenging to break the conventions of that writing style.
It always, like, I think I've definitely found that unless you're writing in a kind of gonzo style in the first place, it's difficult to segue properly between sort of different contexts. You know, and to change voices correctly. But that's the thing that Pickering manages to do, and it makes this like a riveting read, despite its colossal size.
Yeah, no, it like, unlike some books we have read, even though this is a very big book, I would definitely recommend that people actually pick it up and try reading it, because it is enjoyable to read. You know, it's like, yeah, it's a big book, but like, it's just, you know, it's like a 7-course meal that is good and interesting, as opposed to, like, you know, a mountain of cornmeal that you have to eat through, right? Like,
it is not a chore at all. It's like, but it is huge. It's like, it's the size of, it's like as thick as my clenched fist. It is absolutely remarkable how big this thing is.
Yeah.
But like sort of like, but tying it back from like Pickering being like embedded in this sort of work and like interlinked into the material, this is the ontological theater, right? It's a world of continuously interlinked performances, and there's a really crucial thing there, that like the observer and the controller are never outside of the system. They are always embedded within that universe of interlinked performance, and that has deep implications.
Yeah, it's characteristic of theories that focus on ontology is that they situate the knower within the system of knowledge.
Yeah. So we take a bit of a detour then to kind of like talk about like why should we care about this cybernetic stuff? And like the one point that he puts forward is just like, well, mental gymnastics. It's just cool to think about.
Yes,
but also that like, and we've sort of partially covered this, but that like, you know, modern science does sort of make it kind of hard to recognize a lot of the sort of relevant stuff in the world. That the representationalism is too reductive, and that we actually miss out on a lot of the stuff that's like non-cognitive and the stuff that like frankly just resists representation.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is completely correct. Like, I definitely have seen in my life, having gone through the academic system for most of my life, that generally it trained me to know a lot of things, but also to be like completely non-functional as a human being in the world. And that is not an accident, right? That is not a workplace culture thing. That is symptomatic of our like modern academic mode, our modern scientific mode in general, right? That it produces those kinds of people who are specialists in it, right?
I found it like, yeah, that is definitely the case. But I found it like really interesting to kind of think about this this stuff about like representation and knowability and unknowability. In terms of like other stuff like kind of like psychology and psychoanalysis, like kind of like if you go that like Lacanian sort of thing about like having what the hell is this schema? It's like there's the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, where the real is the part that's outside of the mind that like completely resists symbolization. But from the, and there are parallels here with these this sort of ontology that we're setting up. But like it's interesting that like the modern perspective on that is that if the real exists and it resists symbolization, then it's the fault of the real, right? Like that, like there's something wrong with the real because it resists our sort of like imaginary and symbolizing sort of processes. But the other perspective, which I think is actually the correct one, and is the one that like the cyberneticians and kind of later psychoanalysts kind of go with, is that, well, actually no, that's the fault of the mind, right? Like if the representational system fails to capture the novelty of the world, then that's a failure of the representation. Like it's
well, I mean, that gets you as far as Kant, right? But the thing is that it is I think that the properly like systematic way to view this, or the way that I think that cybernetics views this, is like, yes, we have limitations as knowers, but that is a fact in the world, right? Like it is not that we have a mind that is deficient and the world has an infinite plenitude that we cannot know. It is that the mind is also a part of the world, right? And that this kind of, it's not really deficiency so much as there is too much, you know, like it or not too much, but so much, right? It is there's so much variety, there is so much depth, there is so much change that there can never be one account of the world. And that we have to we just have to adapt to the world, and the world will change along with us.
Yeah, which brings us on to like the problem of like the situated knowledge, which is the sort of next touch point, which is just exactly that like it's the observer is inside the system, seeing it from a particular perspective. But at this point, like Pickering sort of goes on a bit of a sort of he really gets the knives out for epistemology at this point, and particularly particularly the linguistic sort of turn in which basically everyone decided to kind of disappear into a vortex of language instead of tackling much of anything. And yeah, he really doesn't like this. It's pretty great.
Yeah,
I love it.
Yeah, I appreciate his sort of like vehement breakdown of that approach. Yeah, definitely. It's I think there's a lot to that. Yeah, the linguistic turn is, a major thing that happened in the later half of the 20th century, and has had just like effects in research across like pretty much every discipline you could think of, right? I think that, well, really this is sort of like a minor history that predates that period, but in sort of our lifetimes, I think that the big sort of switch kind of came when Latour got really big, right? Like there are precedents to Latour in pragmatism, but the thing is that pragmatism became like a very like sideshow minor thing after World War II. And so a lot of what it had to say was forgotten. And it was really with Latour and this kind of idea of like non-modernity that we kind of really started to get this pushback against the linguistic turn, and turn towards things and towards ontology and towards this idea of situated knowing and plenitude and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and like the turn towards ontology is really what Pickering wants to get to here, where like it's essentially kind of restoring the primacy of ontology, of the of things interacting with each other and of the real, and kind of like is it fair to say that it's kind of like sublimating like knowledge and representation as being like a sort of minor bit player in service of the performance?
Yeah, because this is maybe something we'll talk about towards the end of the discussion, but the thing is, like, if you put performance first, knowing is just one part of that performance, right? And if you put experience of the world as something fundamental, then you're much more interested in what sorts of things you are experiencing than how you are experiencing them.
Mm-hmm. Or how you know you're experiencing them. Or
yeah, exactly. Sorry, that's correct. Yeah. So it would be rather how you know the things that you are experiencing. But
then you're using language to describe how you know it. Oh God, we're falling into the pit.
So it's like, like if there's all this stuff in the world and it's weird and it's hard to classify and to get in touch with, to come to grips with, then ontology becomes far more interesting than epistemology, because these are challenging problems that need to be addressed, right, in adapting to the world. This question of knowing is very much a sideshow. It's not irrelevant, but it is a sideshow.
Like we were talking about it in the green room, but it's like it's not. I think I had initially misread it as being like a sort of restoration of ontology to like a 50-50 kind of split with epistemology, but this is much closer to like an 80-20 sort of deal.
That feels right to me, is that like, yes, epistemology is not meaningless. However, there are more important things that we deal with in our lives. Like, there are large sort of swaths of human thinking in this world that grew up outside of Europe, which really don't spend a lot of time on epistemology at all, right? And it's like, well, that like large history of human experience, that large breadth of experience, is not invalid because it is not epistemologically concerned, right? It's just, they were engaging with the world in a different way. Like for example, in India, there were very sophisticated theories of epistemology, but until Buddhism came to China, epistemology was something that was kind of discussed, but it was definitely not the main show in terms of what scholarly individuals were discussing. These are both ways of looking at the world, and if you focus on the ontological one, the epistemological one sort of seems as to be kind of a sideshow.
Okay, yeah, I buy it, definitely. It's also makes me feel a little bit better about not getting to grips with so much of that epistemological stuff. I've always found it quite hard. Like I've come to like philosophy and stuff quite late. Like it's very much a hobby sort of thing for me, and like being kind of selective about what I'm reading and such. But like, I think I struggle with that stuff a bit more. Whereas I read stuff like process ontology, I'm like, oh yeah, that clicks. That's fine. That doesn't seem bananas to me.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, like, I really do hope that later in this show we can do some of like Dewey stuff, because it is like it's really interesting. This kind of the person that usually gets pointed to by Latour or by Pickering is James. But I also think that like reading Dewey's stuff, which is largely known like in education theory, right? Like people usually know Dewey as an educator or a theoretician of education. But if you read his like other stuff about philosophy, it's really, really interesting in terms of process ontology and just sort of like it's a real mind fuck. It's like, oh wow, okay, yeah, It's like you think you get it, and they're like, oh wait, actually,
right. That's what I read this stuff for. It's
yeah.
Yeah. So like I think that's our ontological theater, but Pickering does then like talk a little bit about how like this isn't exactly universal for all these cyberneticians. Like for at least Ashby and Walter, they have a sort of a hybrid modern and non-modern approach where they do talk about, well, the universe is fucking filthy with these black boxes everywhere, and everything seems to contain more black boxes. But it's not like they're shying away from attempts to pry them open either. Like they're sort of like a little bit half and half on that. Which is fine. I mean, it's a hybrid approach, and I think, but they're regarded as like first generation cyberneticians, and it seems to be the second generation that go all in on the non-modern stuff.
And even then, you do see some use of representational models, which is that's okay, that's natural. It's not like we can get along in the world without thinking about how we know things at all. It's just that's not our primary concern in life, right?
Which I found to be kind of interesting, because it's like Pickering eventually makes the point towards the very end that like, well, we're not talking about getting rid of modernism entirely here. We're talking about like augmenting it and kind of like sort of breaking down the hegemony of modernism. But like as I was reading through these chapters, I was kind of like getting a bit carried away with it. I was like, yeah, fuck modernism, fuck representation. Like let's go all in on this stuff, because it's like it's just written in that kind of way where it's just easy to nod along with every argument and go, yeah, cool, let's get into this. But yeah, that's something we'll address like in the back half of the next episode. But he also touches briefly on Kaufman and Wolfram, who did a bit more sort of work on like cellular automata and some other cool stuff, which exhibit like they don't come up very much again, but they exhibit many of the same sort of characteristics of like. They're not so much adaptive systems, but they are systems that like produce like baffling complexity from seemingly very simple like initial conditions, which is about, it's more along the lines of this unknowability thing that like
it's getting to that like very complex systems idea, right?
I think that's maybe something we sort of missed, that like he does mention, well, we'll get to it in the next episode, but like Stafford Beer's classification of like systems as either simple, complex, or exceedingly complex. The first two are kind of like amenable to like modernistic sort of reductive analysis, but the latter, the exceedingly complex systems, like completely resist those kind of techniques, and they require a cybernetic approach.
Well, and the point of cellular automata is interesting, because a cellular automaton in itself is a simple system. it is absolutely capable of being represented, right? Like you can literally write a program spec describing what is a cellular automaton of a given complexity. However, when you actually set these automata to work, then you end up with an exceedingly complex system, right? So that is a very good way of highlighting that difference for sure.
So an example the listeners might be familiar with is like Conway's Game of Life, where you have the grid of cells that are on and off, and then you get this just crazy patterns and stuff. Or is that an example of one of these kind of systems? Am I getting that wrong?
Yeah, totally,
okay,
totally. Right. That is like a Wolfram thing that is based in cellular automata. Yeah. Yeah, and in like machine learning also is that, right? Like we don't understand, like they are black boxes. These programs we produce with machine learning, like we don't understand how they work, right? We just make them and they go. We just like, they are like an excellent example of that cybernetic point of view of like, I don't understand the particulars of how this program works, but I know what kind of behaviors it has.
Yeah, and let's just ride this strange rocket to the end and see where it goes.
Yeah.
But like that unknowability then gives you the kind of like inevitable conclusion that, well, if you can't really know these systems, then you can't really control them, right? Like that control is actually impossible in this kind of like schema, because like, and I think I've read it in Beer's Brain of the Firm that like the kind of explanation here is that like to control a system of a given variety or a given complexity, it requires a controller of at least that complexity. And so it's all kind of impossible. And then this brings us back to the steersman image, right? Like the Kubernetes, the steersman, where the steersman in the boat on the ocean, he's not controlling anything. He's adapting to and influencing the objects around him. Like there's no way he can know the position and velocity of every particle in the ocean. There's no way he can really like grapple with the actual complexity of how the boat interacts with it, but he can steer it. And this is the thing, he's emphatically not controlling the boat, he's steering it, which is different from control.
Yeah.
Which I think was fantastic. Like it was a real kind of light bulb moment. You know.
Right. Totally. And you know, getting to that sort of that question about organizations and knowing the world, I think that the approach that we find in this book offers us perhaps some kind of rejoinder to the exceedingly bleak picture of modernity we get in All Watched Over.
Oh, right? Yeah.
That we cannot know the world, therefore we cannot control the world. And like we have come to grips with our inadequacy, right? Like the inadequacy of our knowledge. That, you know, those are the points that Curtis is really hammering home very, very heavily in terms of like the failures of the modern project. But this kind of adaptive view that we find in the Cybernetic Brain maybe suggests a way out of that isn't just despair.
That is just fantastic, because like to be stuck with the downer ending of All Watched Over would be kind of tragic, you know. So like, yeah, but we do live in an era where like if you like modernity is hegemonic, right? Like, and we presume that modernity is just everything, and that if modernity ever ends, then we're just fucked, right? Like the end of modernity would be barbarism, essentially, right? Is the presumption. And we've come to this point where we kind of have to admit that like modernity's kind of like gotten to the end of its kind of runway in a lot of regards, and like I think it's something we'll see a bit more of in the next episode. But like it's come to the point where like its projects fail because the goals it set itself are literally impossible to achieve. But like that fact doesn't need to mean doom, right? Like there is in fact a non-modern way of looking at the world, and we can synthesize the two of them together.
Yeah, it's just going to be it's going to be very, very difficult to get there, right? Like it's not like, oh, we figured the thing out, therefore it's over. No, like, that is just having knowledge. The performance is the important part, and that is really hard.
I just had that brief moment of like, oh shit, we figured it all out. But yeah, no, the figuring it out is the easy bit. It's fucking doing it is remarkably rough. But that does bring us towards the end of this chapter, though, with like cybernetics as politics, and that like this is sort of like Pickering going into critique mode again. That like cybernetics is often accused of being this kind of like science of control or science of command, but like actually no, the discipline or the anti-discipline accepts at face value that the world is complex and it is filled with complex things and is thus unknowable, and thus control is actually impossible. But the thing that is possible is influence, and like performance within this kind of reciprocal vortex of mutual influence. You can steer within that system, and it's not a. It's not like the conclusion is not that control is impossible, therefore we have to give up entirely. But that we are actually complex. We ourselves are complex systems embodied and embedded within this world of complex systems, and we're all kind of mutually interacting, and there's like these feedback loops firing off all over the place between all the components, and that's a positive vision, really. That like. There is some hope for adaptation, which is the thing we desperately need.
Right, and I think that in a lot of the sort of cybernetic writing, there is a certain amount of pessimism about the world, but there's also a deep sort of optimism that comes through in terms of the capacity for adaptation. Yeah.
Well, there has to be, because like it is like going back to the doorknob example from Ashby. Like, it is self-evident that we actually get along fine in this ontology. We do in fact navigate a world of vast complexity, and we manage to do it with aplomb. Like we're fucking excellent at this, Like, and all the occupants of the universe are excellent at this. Like it is kind of self-evident that this is actually a kind of a fine way to live, and to operate within the universe. Because if it wasn't, this fucking universe wouldn't function, would it? Like,
right,
there wouldn't be anything. And that's actually, I keep saying it, but we'll get into it with Stafford Beer as well, because that does tie in with his, particularly his sort of spiritual outlook. Yeah, I guess, like, is there anything else we need to wrap up on that chapter?
No, I think we pretty much covered it. We'll get more into the sort of particular politics this leads to in the next episode. So I think we pretty much got it.
Nailed it. Yeah. Thanks, listeners, for coming along with us. If you like the show, maybe subscribe, rate, whatever, or share us with your friends. You can follow us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook as well as General Intellect Unit. And if you've been enjoying the show for a while, maybe think about going to patreon.com/General Intellect Unit and throwing us a couple of bucks a month. It really helps out with just like bills and just sort of the expenses of paying for, books that are bigger than your hand, like in terms of thickness,
Yes.
What a monster of a book. It's on my desk right now. It is huge. I've had to move my monitor out of the way to make fucking space for it.
I remember checking that book out of the Kyoto University library and carrying it around in my bag and just being like, wow, like, this is a tome.
Yikes.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening, and we'll be back again in a couple of weeks with part 2. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
Bye.